Hello, everyone. I'm Rev Nhien, founder of Evolving Enneagram. I'm here with my friend Valerie, a colleague in the Enneagram world. I'll be introducing her more formally in a second, but I want to share that we both had an Instagram live today, and due to technical user difficulties on my end, it was not recorded. And I just thought, the information that Valerie in particular shared was so important. I'm very grateful. Thankfully, we like chatting with each other. And so we're back on Zoom now to do a recording so that we can save some of these teachings and be able to offer it to those of you who weren't able to make it live. It was so important for us to share this information. And so today, this is the second, we can just call it an Instagram live, second in a series on the instincts and the Enneagram. And so it's kind of my mission this summer to bring forth this very important teaching within the Enneagram world. So many folks are like, oh, I know my number, but what are the instincts? Or even what are the subtypes? Or some folks begin to learn, they're like, oh, well, I know my subtype within the Enneagram, but what's the instinctual stacking? And more importantly, why do we care? And for me, the value of it is to go back to the beginning, finding our Enneagram type, which Enneagram type can be defined as the emotional habit of a type, right? Which is sometimes called the passion or vice of a type. For the six, it would be fear, kind of thing. So that coupled with the mental habit of the type, right? So there's you won't like the term, but it's called cowardice for the six. The mental habit being a way that the brain tends to sort of ruminate, if you will. And so those things together are actually what define an Enneagram type. And so the behaviors that you often see in the Enneagram world described are just behaviors that are common among people with that kind of orientation. Now, the beautiful thing is once we learn that, we start to see, ways in which we're stuck in a loop, right, around our Enneagram type pattern. But learning about the instincts helps us to see not just our emotional pattern, our mental pattern, but our behavioral pattern. So the instincts are one way we start to name of actually every day in my life, where does the bulk of my energy and attention go? To what zones, domains, or areas of really my survival, if you will? I like to think of the instincts as being about surviving and hopefully ultimately going beyond surviving to thriving. And that's really about learning about the role that the instincts play in our everyday behavior. So with that, I'll just set a basic framework before introducing Valerie, and then I'll invite you, Valerie, to share about your journey with the Enneagram and your discovery of being a type 6, and not only that, but with this particular stacking of social, sexual, and then self-preservation blind. So I'll start by just saying that, the sexual instinct is sometimes called the one-to-one instinct. But for me, as someone identified as sexual dominant, I'm like, oh my God, it's so much more than that. And it's really, I don't find that term to be helpful, because people of the self-preservation dominant instinct sometimes really cherish their one-to-one secure connections, but just for a very different reason. And so the sexual instinctual energy is about sex, but it's not just about sex. If you think about it, you got to leave the house in order to find a partner. So it's about leaving your house. It's about expanding your energy. It's about making your life sublime, even transcendent. It's about where's the juice? It's that kind of energy. It's intense. So depending on what number you already are, it's going to multiply the intensity in that number. So this is just a short version so that we can have a meaningful conversation today. And then the social instinct, and Valerie will elaborate on this in a second because that is her dominant. But in general, this awareness of the group dynamics, navigating the realm, who's doing what? I want to know, so I can find my sort of position or my role in relation to the community, to otherness, if you will. And so that's the social instinct. And then self-preservation instinct relates to like nesting and nurturing, basic well-being, like the well-being of my body, of my finances, like those fundamentals of life, usually like shelter over my head. So my home, in caveman days, it could have been the cave, and now, it's our house, it's our 401k, etc. And kind of looking at these areas of life, like that domestic aspect. And there's also an energy in self-preservation around conservation. So this is just a brief summary of the 3 instincts. And again, the importance of this is, number one, in claiming our dominant, we can overvalue our dominant instinct, and it becomes disproportionately valued in our life, where most of our life energy gets spent in this way. And so there's an imbalance that can be created. And then the one that we value the least is called our instinctual blind spot. And in upcoming posts on Instagram, I'll continue with the series that I've been doing. I'll be posting more about like, once we recognize what's blind, that's the beginning of not being blind to that area. But then like, how do we start to work with it to create some balance? And why is it that we tend to neglect this area? Things around like our judgment around that area as like, who cares? Like, why is this important? Things like that. So that's just the basic overview to provide a framework for Valerie. So Valerie, I would love for you to introduce yourself. So Valerie is a psychotherapist who focuses on both sex and relationships. Yes. And you are a teacher at the School of Awakening in Asheville. Yes.
Yeah.
Enneagram School of Awakening. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so from that, let's begin with your personal journey. And then I'd love to hear a bit about how you use the Enneagram in your work. So your journey of discovering your type and how you know you are this type with this particular stacking.
Sure. Yeah. Journey is definitely the appropriate word for it. So I, in discovering my type, I initially identified with type 3. That was the one that made the most sense for me. And, I discovered the Enneagram in my early 20s, and I was definitely at this place in life where I was like trying to find my way, working a lot. I've always had this propensity towards like working a lot, and not just like one job, like usually having like many jobs. I would go on these sprints of working like 50, 60 days in a row without a day off for no reason. It was not like that I was like doing anything over like they needed me to do that. That was just like how I designed my life. So for me, the Ennea-Type 3 was like, oh yeah, that's the one, right? Because like clearly, like I'm trying to get some value through this. I don't really have direction. I don't really know like who I am or where I am. And I knew that I had this capacity to adapt, right? Like, cause in all of the jobs that I did, I would adapt. Like I taught painting classes, and I had this certain style that I would show up in that. And I worked downtown in restaurants and had a different style for that. And then I also worked in a school. And so I just was very aware that I had this kind of ability to adapt, have this kind of chameleon-like effect, and that I just had this really interesting relationship with like working, right? And like being competent. And so for a while I was like, oh, I'm a 3, and I was doing the work of the 3, and I was kind of like, yeah, I'm like pretty good 3, but like in reality, it's like, no, I just wasn't that type, because I was like, oh, I'm a 3, but not in this way. Oh, and I don't do that. And oh, like actually, my relationship, like everything was really clear, like I could see all of those things. And for some 3s, those are actually the things that are really difficult for them to see. But for me, it was like really obvious. I was able to like admit it and recognize it. So over time, the thing that I wasn't able to see was all the fear. Right. And so at some point, it was actually kind of, this is like the humility of the journey, right? Like I was teaching a cohort, and people in the cohort were like, are you sure you're not a 6?
Wow.
And so I had to like, and then through that with them, I was like, wow, yeah, like that's actually there. But I had no idea, because I really did not identify with fear. And I also was aware that there was this part that was like, don't be weak, right? Like, don't be weak, don't be scared. And I knew that, so there was some posturing around that. And once I really honed in on that, I was able to find all the different ways that like doubt, questioning, anxiety, that some of these other things that I wasn't really connecting to fear were manifesting in my body and coming out, and these other types of thinking patterns. And then from there, it was just like Pandora's box of fears really opened up, and I was able to see it all differently.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, and I think this is so important to note for those of you who are listening, and maybe you're still in discernment around even your number and whether you might be a 6, that even though, you know, when I do typing interviews, one of the questions is like, what's your relationship to fear? And, you know, some 6s are like, not so much, but then they might amend it and they were like, well, but I worry a lot. And I'm, you know, like my friends say that I'm a worrier. My family says I'm a worrier, or and I'm very anxious. I'm like, oh, they just don't connect with even like that felt emotion that feels so base of fear. And also there's a piece to this around the fact that so often our Enneagram type, it is, you know, it's called, it's like a transparent lens, meaning a lens through which we see the world, but we don't see the lens. And if fear has been there all your life, it's like, it just feels normal. It doesn't feel like fear. Like there's a baseline there. And so it does like take this degree of work to go, let's check in. Like, so maybe that word or the emotion of fear, one doesn't connect with. And then, as you said, you have a strong, we'll talk about like your middle, right? Which is the sexual instinct that kind of goes against what it fears, right? It kind of like, let me show you fear. I'm going to show how brave I am, you know, but it's still in relationship to fear. It's still like fear is so intimate, you know, so embedded with it, if you will, you know, but that's an important thing to note, just for those of you who are kind of still seeking, ask, use some synonyms around the word fear, you know, like there's, oh, like, do you tend to plan for the worst case scenarios or plan against the worst case scenarios? Do people see you as a worrier? Do you tend to worry about what could go wrong in situations, you know? And then as we talk about instincts here today, fleshing out even what areas you're worried in, because I think this is an important piece, knowing that your stacking, like my stacking, that you identify as self-preservation blind. And so a 6 that is self-preservation dominant is going to be worried, or preparing against worst case scenarios in a different region or area of life than you. So I'm curious if you'll share a little bit more about that distinction, like where your worry goes mainly, like what it goes toward. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that like picking up from the self-preservation 6, which is not what I'm dominant in, but I think that description, or the main description that most of us are familiar with when we're really kind of starting out with the Enneagram, of like 6's relationship to fear and preparing contingency plans and having like 6 fire extinguishers in the house, you know, it's like those things tend to be more in the domain of the self-preservation, right? Because they're living really close to home with like physical safety in my body and also concerned about the people around me, right? And my environment, what's going to happen. Yes. And so for me, self-preservation blind, like that stuff is not on my radar, you know. That's the stuff that's like it's not even in the back seat. It's like, because it's not in the car, right? Like I left it somewhere else.
Not even in the car.
And,
that's great.
Yeah. So it's very neglected. And so that was another part for me that made it hard to identify myself as a 6. And so the words for me that helped me kind of hone in was the like concern, also my relationship with control. You know, a lot of 6s, a lot of our behaviors are about like trying to control, you know, and my control is not even necessarily, it's like on the safety stuff, it's about controlling myself, right? Like so much like containing energy in order to be like having the appropriate response and reaction and adapting to the environment. And what does the space need, right? So for me, when I think about the social instinct, I really love Russ Hudson's zone models, because I think that was really the key for me that opened it up, because for a long time I identified as sexual because and this is probably very social of me, like, well, Beatrice Chestnut says this and Russ Hudson says that. And I'm like, I agree with this and I don't agree with that, you know, but it's hard for me to not explore it or to not explain that, to kind of help understand my journey. So, because I think that with the 27 subtypes, I think that that work is amazing and beautiful and super helpful. And in a way, I kind of see them like, they are like archetypes. And I didn't quite identify with the sexual archetype fully or the social fully. And I think for me, those two are actually, my sexual instinct is quite strong. And the parts that I identified with in that, and I think some of this also has to do with stage of life, is like this contrarian element, right? That the sexual instinct is kind of like, it's less about what's, you know, right and wrong, what's safe or whatever, but it's like, oh, you guys all think it's that, well, what about this? Oh, you guys all think it's this thing, well, what about that? You know, if you guys are all going to doubt, then I'm going to have the positive perspective, and if you guys are having the positive perspective, I'm going to pull you in over here and be like, well, what about this part? You know, and kind of like holding the pessimism in the room.
Right. Right.
So that for me was something that felt, and there's a lot of energy in that, you know. So I think that there was this larger period of my life where I was seeing a lot of what I was identifying as maybe more counterphobic responses. And the counterphobic tends to be more associated with the sexual, because it does take a certain amount of capacity for intensity to be able to move towards the scary thing, right? Like kind of like what you were mentioning, Nhien. But when I look across like the broad scope of my life, the thing that I noticed that tended to be the most consistent were like the places where I felt the most pain, the places where like my most kind of neurotic patterns will come out, and also the places where I've like experienced the most joy, right? The most highs and the most lows were definitely within the social realm. And so the sexual stuff was still there, but it was kind of like these blips. And even within the parts that live in the sexual instinct, right? So in my, those like intimate, juicy relationships, there is also still a part of me that it's using those to find guidance and direction towards like my role, right? Or my place in life, and like what function I'm filling. And I often find those relationships within the groups that I'm a part of, things that are really within the social realm. So is it okay if I say just a little bit more about the social? Because I feel like I went
absolutely. I hope, yeah.
So, and I think that, you know, for me, the social instinct in terms of identifying the ways that I'm really focusing on interpretation, like within the group setting, in terms of like reading between the lines, attunement, empathizing, like kind of really reading the room, but not the same as like merging with the room. I'm not feeling other people's feelings. I'm not taking stuff in. I'm like noticing, and then I'm adapting. Like, oh, we're up here doing a fun thing. Okay, energy is fun. I'm gonna adapt to that. Like, oh no, it's serious. Like I'm gonna be in the serious, right? So I think that part of the social is a really important piece of it. Plus, already being an adapting type means that I'm kind of getting a double dose of that. And so I would notice that like if I enter a space, whatever kind of emotional experience I was having before that, like it kind of gets left at the door, and it's not something that I would even feel like I had control of. It's like this very like automatic energetic shift.
Interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear the subtle difference, because I know you've navigated the decision between sexual and social, and I kind of I have very strong social, and like that line between social and sexual, but when you describe it at that level, I tend to blast through a room more. Like I'm more likely to like lead the energy of the room. Like if I don't like it, I'm like, let's go this way. Not like comply with it, but I can. Like, but it's really like a choice I make, you know, that isn't like my first default. Like it's a very like, do I want to do this or not? And even the awareness of if there's someone special like in the room, like if there's like, ooh, like an interesting like person I'd rather, like that pulls my attention in a very great way away from the whole. Like I can navigate kind of because I have to, you know, I'm a minister, like I hold spaces for communities, but I like my attention like wants to go over there. Whereas as I understand your awareness, even in your partnership, there's a little bit more tension around being pulled toward the group, if you will. And I'd love to hear you kind of talk a bit about that. Yeah.
And I think, you know, so for me, like I can definitely relate to the, I'm going to notice my attraction, I'm going to notice like where the juice is, right? but also I don't usually like move towards that. It's just kind of like, oh, it's on my radar. But if I'm going to engage with that person or that idea or that thing, I'm kind of like still, I'm doing it through the container of like the group or like what we're talking about, right? Through the topic or through kind of like the shared interests rather than kind of like really lasering in on it. Yeah. And I think that, you know, another part for me with this is that the part of the social instinct that's about like connecting, about creating and sustaining relationships, you know, just and that is very different than creating that like really deep, quick chemistry. You know, it's like, ooh, like all the adrenaline rush. It's more of like a different kind of capacity for like what sometimes some sexual doms would be like boring, you know, like this is like a really boring conversation. There's no substance here. And it's like, I don't know if there's no substance. It's not like, you know, I'm not like losing my mind over this conversation, you know, but like, I'm like interested, right? I'm learning about like the different components, like, oh, like, what do you do? Like, how do we fit together? Like, what can we build together? You know, like how can both of our energies combine and we are able to like have this relationship, and how does that work? And, or like, we don't, you know, it's like you're in my group or you're not, you know, there's also a lot of attention to that. So it's not like socials are like, yay, we're all inclusive. It's also a lot about like, who in here does not fit? You know, like you are clearly sticking out, and like, why are you here? You know,
That's awesome.
Sometimes it's me.
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, fantastic. And I just want to note, like, for those who are listening, you know, as we go deeper into this journey of awareness, the awareness of like even how your body feels as you listen to us talk, like I'd encourage those of you listening and watching to like just pay attention. Like when people start talking about self-preservation issues, like I get really bored. Like even when I care about the person, and I just noticed that when you were just starting to talk about like, yeah, we could go into this talk, I could feel my attention just subtly start to drift. And like, I was really resonant with, yeah, where's the juice? Like, what's the, you know, it's just fascinating. I mean, it's different now because I've learned to be aware of that. But before you just like check out, like that's the lack of like this dominant instinct has so much pull. Like, even as you say, it's almost like you said symbolically, if there's someone like juicy in the sexual instinct, hey, can they blend into the group? Like, can you bring them into the group of belonging, you know, versus me more tending to like, can I leave the group? Can we leave? You know, so just that distinction. But I also want to make it, since we're talking about sixness today, and it'd be helpful to hear the distinctions among the three types of sixes. We talked a bit about the self-preservation six, and I want to add that could be a look-alike to the type 2. And in fact, just yesterday, I did an Enneagram typing interview, and by the end of it, we discerned kind of jointly, she confirmed that even though her testing was like, she tested high in 2 and 9, that and 6 as well, that it was clearly like connecting with being that warrior and such. But probably she was a self-pres 6, and that it made sense because that's also called warm and friendly. And the hidden, often unconscious agenda of the self-pres 6 that I once heard that was so beautiful was like, if I shake hands and we're friends, you won't kill me. Like, I mean, it is this base level of like friendliness of like, see, and also I'm not threatening, you know, and kind of sending that energy out. And so you could see how that energy can feel warm and friendly and therefore look like a 2. And so yeah, I'd love for you to share about the lookalikes for the social 6. Talk about that a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the social 6 lookalikes, definitely, like I was saying earlier, I think the 3, like I think that my social instinct was definitely kind of contributing to the me misidentifying. And I mean, also this was like a lot of people in my life who knew the Enneagram really well were like fully like, yeah, you're a 3, you know, but and I think that part of that is that like, so remembering that there's fear in my system, right? And the main place where it's really kind of coming out and the focus of my attention is within the social orientation, which is also about like for me, you know, as a 6, it's about performance, it's about competence, it's about, am I well spoken? Do people think that my ideas are bright and intelligent and la la la? And so since there's insecurity there, the way that I've managed that is I get tighter, right? I get more controlled. I do a lot more preparing, a lot of like rehearsing and scripting, and like I've had this conversation with you like 16 times in my head this morning before we even met, you know, and that for me, it's like, I won't be like, think that I'm anxious. But then when I realize that I am like doing the talk that I haven't had yet, I'm like, oh, okay, I think that I'm, you know, I'm probably feeling nervous about this, you know. So, and that's where the preparing comes up for me. I'm not preparing in a self-preservation way in terms of like making sure that I have all of the things set up and finances just right and backup plans. Like I don't do any of that, but it is really about like, I'm trying to make sure I don't embarrass myself. You know, I'm also trying to make sure that in the workplace that I'm coming from a place that is, that I'm maintaining a sense of integrity, right? Because I want people to trust me, right? And I want to make myself a really trustworthy person. So the integrity piece is really important. That can start to look really one-like, because then I get really kind of, like very direct in like some of the values that I might hold, and are we together, you know, considering this, or what about this group, right? Look, you know, really kind of looking out for the underdog and speaking up for that. And so then that kind of anxiety focus on the social can push me towards coming out more, speaking up more, and having what looks like a more confident presence, but really it's kind of mostly getting fueled by some fear. Now, when I'm in a more relaxed state, I still care about those things and I can still speak to that, but it's like the energy is so different, right? It's coming from a deeper place in me. It's not this like tight and kind of, and that's where that coldness, you know, the social 6 is often kind of described as like the cool 6, right? It's kind of like this aristocratic kind of tight, you know, but that's like the more fear that's in there, the tighter that I get. And it's more so because I'm trying to contain. I don't want people to see it. You know, I'm trying to maintain the image.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think you and I have talked recently about how I think, and before I knew the Enneagram, if someone came across like that stiffness about them, like I would have assumed the worst. You know, I would have assumed like they don't like me, or they're just a jerk, or like they're snobby or superior. And now there is much like a broader like possibility for what that means. And knowing you're a 6 already, not even knowing you're a social 6, you know, my instinct is when I see that sort of more kind of apparently rigid way of being, I'm like, oh, she's scared. Like how do I as a friend create safety? Like that's my first response. How do I create safety for the connection and for the well-being that I seek in this space, right? You know, that's a very different response, like to understand like, oh, and like suddenly, okay, there's like, if I try and I create safety and I see you warm up and melt like that, oh, okay, that just validates that that's what was going on, you know. And I want to also name that, you know, you do have a line, 6s do have a line to 3. And so that like confusion about 3-ness, when a 6 unconsciously under stress goes to the lower 3, right? And so that image and that like caring, so it's like exacerbated by the social instinct of like what will people think, you know. And but the different motivation is, it's whether like is my self-concept validated, you know, like, and is it valued, or am I safe? You know, like, does that result in safety and that 6 desire to feel safe as a result of that, you know? But yeah, so that social instinct looking 3-ish, but also in stress, 6 is going to 3. And so how that might play out. Yeah. So what about that sexual piece? I know you talked about there's a bit of that like intenser energy of the sexual. So I want to kind of maybe elaborate a little bit more on what that can look like. So we just talked about how the social looks like a 1 or a 3. And I've even seen certain brands of social 6s where the desire for like, why aren't people obeying the mask laws? So, you know, like there's that righteousness that can come out that feels very 1-ish, right? Well, for safety, right? But for safety, which is that big distinction for certainty, security, or safety being more core values for the six. And then going into the sexual six, again, noticing that that behavior can actually, if you're only looking at the surface, look eight-ish, because sexual sixes with their intensity, they go toward that which they fear, right? So, and they go against it. And so there's this energy of going out like this when it's compulsive, jumping off cliffs because you're afraid of it. I mean, when it's compulsive, that's where you see the sort of cliche counterphobic six who's the daredevil, what they call the daredevil. But it's not like this conscious decision. It's like you're compulsively needing to, deep down, consciously or not, driven by this, to offset the inner sense of fear by feeling the moment's sense of courage. Like it counters that feeling. And so that counterphobic aspect, to counter your fear with a burst of courage, that like for a second, and then you need more, and so that kind of going against can happen in that energy. And you did note that even what looked maybe on the surface like sexual six energy in you, right, that might make the sexual six dominant of you, sort of testing, even the examples you use have a lot to do with like, well, it's almost like challenging the group, challenging the group's opinions and like there's still a strong relation to the group. Whereas I find sexual sixes are even more about challenging just themselves, like there's a self orientation that isn't other related. It's just like, what excites me or what scares me? Okay, let's go do it. Like, I don't know what other people are doing, like, yeah. And then the last thing I want to say is, I mean, you described this beautifully, Valerie, where it isn't so I want to go back and cite some sources just to give credit where credit is due here. Claudio Naranjo brought this subtypes teaching to the United States. Beatrice Chestnut, through a lot of his teachings, wrote this wonderful book called The Complete Enneagram that talks about the 27 subtypes. What we mean by that is your core number plus your dominant instinct. That's just 27 though. And what Valerie and I are talking about today is more than 27, because we think it's not just important what your dominant or your top is. As you're saying, Valerie, social and then sexual second, what's different from social and then self-preservation being second, right? And so just being aware that your energy is going to be a little bit more intense, than if you were social and then self-preservation, which is much more contained about, your well-being in your home, that kind of thing. So if there's anything you want to add about that, just want to open up to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would add also to that, because we haven't talked about authority yet, and it's like, well,
how could we not?
One for sixes, right? Authority and power.
Yes.
And I think that that was something for me too, right? When I'm looking at like social and sexual, because the social part and the way that as a social instinct dominant that I'm orienting to authority and power, social instinct on its own is already going to kind of know what the hierarchy is, what everyone's role and function is, and the different types are going to do different things with that and engage with it differently. With the six, I'm really kind of evaluating power, authority, how those things are being used. Is it being used against me? Is it being used to aid me? Is it being used against or aiding other people? What is my relationship to that? And I do have a propensity towards wanting to be in good graces with authority. However, this is where I feel like the subtype description of the social for me doesn't fully fit, because it's lacking the other nuance of that stacking, right? Because if we just take social on its own, then this is a very kind of dutiful, following the rules, obeying the authority, but it's not really being clear about how all sixes are ultimately the ones who are deciding who that authority is.
Yes.
And we're constantly putting people in places of authority and taking them out. And they're not always asking to be there, and that might not even be their role, but we're kind of casting them in it. And all three do different things with that. And as a social, I want to be, I want to be in collaboration with the authority. You know, I want them to also respect me because I respect them, but I'm always doing this thing where I put them here and I put myself here, and then I'm working really hard to be, you know, at their level and respected, but it's all a thing that I've created in myself. Whereas the other two types don't quite do that. You know, the sexual instinct with authority, they have you know, and I'm not sexual dom, so I can't fully speak for them, but at least from what I have seen and what I understand of it, is that there is a quicker, there's a lot more testing of the authority, there's a lot more pushing the authority and kind of doing it in a more provocative way to see if they can trust them. Whereas as a social, I'm not going to do any of that testing. I'm certainly not going to provoke them. I'm either just going to kind of like make that decision, they're going to be the authority or they're not. And I'm either going to try to be in a relationship with it, or I'm just like, that one doesn't matter.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It is nuanced, you know, and no one yet that I know of has written thoroughly, you know, on the nuances of the stacking, you know, at least not in a book. I know some folks have blogged and et cetera about it, but this will be very helpful. And I think it's people like you, like, you know, I come from some training in the narrative tradition where it's the stories of people sharing about their experience in this that's going to help us flesh this out and understand it a lot better. But yes, going back to this idea, to me, every six has, I mean, if the whole thing is like, what can I trust? What can I trust? Like, I go inside, I can't trust myself. Like, I'm not so sure about that. Then I better trust you. You know, is it my partner that I need to trust? Is it the group? Is it the authority? You know, and then so sort of a wanting to trust, but really still not being able to. And the dance of almost like you being above the authority, saying, nope, I'll discard this one. Not try. I vetted it, checked it. Nope. You know, so that makes me a little higher in this moment, but I'm wanting someone higher than me. And so the quest for that is just an interesting kind of dance that I think is ongoing, right? Like that doesn't ever really get resolved. It's like the until, you know, there's a deeper journey of like learning to trust something deep within yourself as a ground of being, right? Like in that spiritual aspect. Yeah. So yeah. But I think that, so now I feel like we've thoroughly chatted about the sixes, different subtypes, and I'd love to talk about your work, Valerie, and first how you see the instincts play out in the work that you do in sex and relationship therapy. Yeah. So
yeah, and I can't remember now if you said this in this talk or the one that we had before this. So I'm going to say it again just in case, because I think that it's really true and it's really well said by you earlier. And that, and I see this all the time in my work, that the place where in relationship where we can have the most conflict and the most difficulty is when there is a big difference in our instinctual stacking in terms of if one person is dominant in something and that is the other person's blind spot, that it causes friction. And also sometimes the thing that can kind of feel unchangeable, you know, and a lot of times, you know, we're wanting the other person to just start orienting to the world that we do, right? Because if you're sexual dominant, right, then what you're going to be looking for in this relationship is that experience of the intensity, right, and the chemistry and the like kind of alchemical merging, right, and all of that juiciness. And if I'm blind,
okay. Anyway, every time you talk about like that, I'm like, I mean, something in my whole system, like I want to follow you now.
Yeah, and even your reaction of it, like that is how the sexual instinct is. It's that like,
totally.
like that aliveness, you know, that charge.
Yes.
Like, oh, I'm alive.
So anyway, there's a visual here, you know, of like that is like there's this juiciness, and like I could feel sparks coming out, and like I moved, like all my energy like moved toward you, like yes. Like
do it, it's merge.
Yes. So the sexual. Yeah. Anyway, we're talking about other instincts as well. Go ahead. So
that's a sexual dominant, right? And if you're sexual blind, all of that stuff that we're talking about is oftentimes there's like, it doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
It's like, what? You know, and so then the sexual dominant person is kind of coming out and reaching for that and offering it and seeking it and just getting what feels like in return. And that often gets interpreted as, you don't care, you don't love me, like, why aren't you trying? Like, why don't you know? And then sometimes it's like, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. And the person who's sexual blind is like, you know, kind of, if they're self-preservation dominant, then they're probably being, you know, practical and like, sure, I'm willing to try, let's go. But still, the energy that they bring isn't gonna match that.
Yeah.
And so that's a place where it can take, like having that knowledge is really helpful, and having a lot of like acceptance for that difference when there is a big you know, difference there between the two. And then finding a way where we can kind of like meet in the middle, and also how each of us can learn to strengthen whatever is in that blind spot. So that is something I would say within my work, as we're talking about instincts, and especially in sexual relationships, this is huge, right? But even just relationships in general, but how that shows up.
Right. It struck me that I want to talk about, I can't believe when I introduced you, I didn't mention that you are the person that Evolving Enneagram, we're going to be doing a small group, an intimate group together, facilitating a group that meets every 2 weeks, starting in September, on sex, soul, and the Enneagram. And we want to make clear, I think, yes, like I'm so excited to be journeying with you in that, because these are juicy topics, juicy and edgy topics, which I love. I'm like, this is like the most exciting sort of edge of living for me. And yet understanding from you and others I've interacted with who have different instinctual stackings of like, oh, well, but what I'm even talking about is different depending on what your instinct, like your dominant instinct is, how you even, like the meaning that you put on sex, like the act of sex, or what it is in the relationship, or how much you care about it, relates to your dominant versus like your blind spot, right? Your dominant instinct versus your blind spot. And I'd love for you to just give a little teaser about what that might look like in terms of like the meaning, right, of that we put on sex. That we get to talk about together.
Yes, that we will dive into. And because there are so many different things that can influence our relationship to sex and sexuality, right? There's cultural messages, there's family of origin, there's religious messages, there's values, there's gender norms, you know, there's all this stuff. And there's also our Enneagram type, right? And part of that, as you just mentioned, Nhien, is about the meaning making, right? And a lot of times the meaning making is coming out of some ego gratification, right? Like, what is it that I need? And I'm trying to get it through this thing. And so then what we do is we ascribe some meaning to it. And so then when I get the thing, that now means I feel loved, or I feel secure, or I feel safe, right? So there's definitely some meaning making that occurs here that is type specific. But when you look also carefully at the instincts, this is also where we see a really big influence. So for example, the self-preservation, I'm gonna really like oversimplify this.
Yes.
But the self-preservation instinct tends to have meaning making that has like a relationship to functionality that is different than the other two. That is not to say that self-preservation only relate to sex through the function of because it feels good, and the physiological release or the physical release for stress relief, right? Feeling pleasure in the body. Those do tend to be things that self-preservation will orient to. And that for some other types, right? For some other dominant instincts, it's like, yeah, sex can feel good, but that's not the reason why I'm reaching for it, right? Yeah. Like for me as a social dominant, self-preservation blind, it's never occurred to me that like, oh, I need to have an orgasm, or I need to have sex so that I can feel relaxed. I'm like, that's not, sure, like it's nice, like, oh, it's good, but it's not quite the thing that I would ever say that I need, right? That this kind of like, so self-preservation dominant can feel like they're living a little bit closer to those needs, to the physiological element of it. The sexual instinct has more of this alchemical meaning making, right? And so this is kind of what we were touching on earlier. Like, here it comes, they're bringing the juice back. There's this
like, I was like, who cares if it's not ecstatic? So.
Yeah, but that's the thing Like they want sex to be about merging, right? And losing themselves to it. And it's like surrendering. And, it's all of this, like you and me, and also wanting to be passionate, right? There's no good enough sex. It needs to be like peak experiences. So there can be also a seeking peak experiences through sex too. And also a lot of times, some of the alchemical part is there are a lot of sexual dominant people who are really into Tantra, and that Tantra is just like, they may not have ever even heard of it or studied it, but they're kind of already bringing that into their sexual experiences. So there can be, also, I find that this is the instinct that tends to kind of naturally integrate spirituality and sexuality together, right? Like sex is a spiritual practice.
Yes, yes, yes. All of the above, check. So, yeah. And it is hard, and when I hear you, like, this is where couples can struggle, right? Because I'm like, why would you do it if it wasn't like that? Like, we have this bias, right? That like doesn't habitually or default get like what the others seek in something like that, right? Like, to me, the other ways just seem so banal or mundane. It's like, it's not worth my time. like like, oh, just for that. Just,
yeah,
okay. I mean, God, like, yeah, just like eating dinner. Just like, so, but recognizing and not devaluing it is part of the gift of learning about the instincts in the Enneagram, right? Like really getting it, that like you really are looking for something different. And through both of us understanding each other's differences, like we can even just begin to offer our partner like what the other is looking for, that we weren't necessarily, but that could end up being a gift for ourselves, that we didn't know to look. We didn't know to seek that, right? And I've found that just even relationally, of understanding differences, not even just in sex, but just in relationship, of like, oh, this gift of stability that the self-preservation instinct, or even the social, really, the longevity of relationship that I have lacked in my life, oh, there's a solidity that I didn't know to look for it. So I never got the gift of it. And so I didn't know how to give this gift until I kind of opened my capacity to receive it, and so I think that this supporting of couples who love each other, but find these areas where this disconnect, right, keeps happening, to be able to support like a different, like to really love, right? And I think you said this earlier, whether it's in this time or the live session we had, that I mean, this is a tender spot for me because my ex is sexual blind, and so this response of I don't even understand what you want, like from him. I don't even understand what you're wanting from me. Because in his view, he gave me everything. And from my view, I could even see that, but it didn't feel like enough because the thing I needed the most wasn't happening, that intensity and that like, yeah. And so realizing that like it was so confusing to me, the notion that you don't get it, and then if you all listened to my talk with Lindsay last week, she's sexual blind, and she kind of basically said the same thing. I'm like validating, oh, you're really not just willfully not giving this to me. You really don't understand it because it's in your blind spot. That's huge to comprehend, right? So yeah, so amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say a little something about the social too, right? And but I also want to add, because this kind of, I feel like it matches what you were saying, is that a lot of sexual dominant instinct folks also, it's like sex is about everything else except for the act. It's almost like, there's less about the what we do, but it's about everything before and after, and the intensity and the feeling. It's like about so many other things than like the actual, mechanics of sex. And I think that that's something that I have seen a lot when there's self-pres dominant and a sexual dominant. They're like, you asked me to do the thing, I did the thing. Right? You wanted this, I did that. Oh
my God, I did the thing.
Like, it's not about the thing. It's about like, it's kind of like, I think, it's not about the outfit, it's about how you're wearing it. Like you and I could wear the same thing, but you'll wear it so differently.
Yeah.
So that piece.
And then you reminded me too, the distinction when we talk about intensity and passion in the sexual instinct, it does feel more like chemistry, right? It's that pizzazz. It's not necessarily connection. So a lot of people confuse that emotional connection is more in the social instinct realm. But this is more like chemistry, and it can fade in a day. Like sadly, in my past, I'm in love. And like 2 hours later, it was like, it could be almost that quickly, of really recognizing, oh, that wasn't real. That was like a chemistry that I felt, but it's not the sustainable love, emotional connection that I think is more the province, of the social, of that enduring, sustaining relationship quality that socials have. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. And there's even like, excuse me, like totally different chemicals that are, showing up in the brain from those two different states, right? Because a lot of the sexual instinct is a state of arousal. And, that's like dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, and like connection and bonding is more like oxytocin.
Interesting.
I just lost those two. Progesterone? No, I think that's something else. Well, two other ones. And that's more of like those bonding chemicals. And so for the social instinct, the meaning making that tends to be more common for social in sexual relationships is that sex is it's like a relational meaning making. It's about bonding. It's about being responsible to the relationship, right? Just continuing to kind of come back and kindling the connection, showing up for it. And so what that can sometimes, and this is something I totally relate to, and something that I've had some shame about in the past, because it's like, like I'm keeping track of how much we're having sex, and it's not necessarily I'm keeping track of the quality, but it's like when it's like a frequency thing, right? Because then if it's happening, then it's like, okay, I'm using it as this like barometer for the health and connection in our relationship. But my partner is social blind. So to him, it's like, he does not care about frequency. For him, it's more, he's self-preservation and sexual. So he wants and he's a 4. So there's also the, like, he wants it to be emotional and connective and love, but also like, there is this kind of like physicality, functional piece that's showing up with it too, but it's kind of bolstered by the sexual instinct. So for him, he's like, well, I'd rather just like, we're gonna have periods where we just aren't desiring each other, and that's fine. And I had to like learn how to feel okay with that, because for me it was kind of this belief that like this is a way that we stay connected. And also, another side of this is that sometimes I think that when there is a really secure connection, if there's not, and this might be maybe more of a 6 story than some of the other types, but if I'm, because again, we're still bringing our type into it. So if I'm seeking security, and I'm doing that through connection and through kind of, fostering the sexual relationship, if things feel really secure, that might just be totally off my radar now, right? So now I have to create a new meaning or a new motivation to move towards that. And so finding other ways that sex actually feels, desirable to me if my dominant instinct needs are being met in other places.
So are you saying you only move toward to build connection and security where it feels broken, but when it feels secure, you don't move forward?
Yes. If it's like, oh, we haven't had a lot of time together and I've been really busy, and then I'm kind of like, oh, I miss him. I really, really want my partner, like I'm going to like make time for it and like prioritize it. And then, but like, if we're getting a lot of time together, it's like, I might still want that, right? Because I want to feel close and I want to feel connected, but it doesn't have the same kind of, there's a little bit more of an urgency, and I'm kind of like prioritizing it from a slightly like I need to. I haven't been around. I haven't been available. I need to.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. And as you're sharing, I appreciate your candor in this. And I could talk forever with you about this topic. And I know we need to wrap it up soon, but I want to say that for me, I just had this like remembrance of how I probably did some push me, pull me activity for me to heighten for the desire for this sort of heightened connection in the sexual instinct, like that there's some like letting go of so that I can like increase the intensity of the
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
in my past, people, in my past. Pre-awakening, right? You know, but definitely some of that. And oh, you could hear the critters outside. So okay, have we covered them all? Also,
one little piece to that before we move on is that, so for someone who's self-preservation dominant, that is so like
horrifying.
Yeah, well, not even like horrifying, but it's just more of like humanizing, right? Because it's like the comfort, the security is going away now. And so for people who are self-pres dominant, it's actually like makeup sex, right? Or like, oh, we just had this really big fight and now let's connect. It's kind of like, no, now I kind of like need to go and chill and recalibrate, because like that just unsettled my whole system. And I actually kind of need to build my energy reserves more before I'm able to feel okay enough to connect with you and be that open and vulnerable. And so then if you're sexual dominant, right, that can be like, you know, like now I'm ready, or now I want you. And
so, confusing. It would be confusing. And, but, you know, even as you were sharing it, my heart just like, I mean, compassion kind of is just widening in terms of like comprehending the different dominant instincts and how they play out. And then I was even reflecting on how, oh, this makes sense that in the beginning of our relationship, my partner, who identifies as a social, now he thought it was sexual only because he's intense, but we could really see the social, and it makes sense that he was more romantic than I am. Like that, like his heart had to, like it, like I had to be someone in his life. Like that was more important to him than to me, you know? And so it's just kind of interesting to kind of see that. Really sweet. But like this heart space that wanted to be there, wanted to have that, and not just like the physical or even excited act, if you will. Yeah, so differences. Anyway, oh my goodness. So I guess I want to end by sharing or naming the group that we're about to start, that was going to start in August. We had to change it, which changes, like it opens up registration. And so we have new spaces. We're trying to figure out what the best timing is, but we're thinking the first Wednesday in September, and it'll go for 6 sessions every other week. And it will really be like this, to explore topics such as this. It's really open to folks of any sexual orientation or gender identification. And it's not, I think it was important for us to talk about how this is not just if you feel, in fact, it's not for those who are in the midst of a traumatic experience right now, that it's more for those who are kind of ready to talk about it at a certain level, even for thriving within this area, or sorting out some of the issues you might be having either in dating or in your sexual relationship to yourself, you know, or with your partner. So it's really any and all of the above. We just really, we feel like this conversation is so important to have. The role of the instincts and of the Enneagram within sexuality is important, and that added piece of soul. I want to say that you chose the word soul for our group very intentionally, because I think the word spirituality can be way too highfalutin and bring up more baggage. And that soulfulness can be really about like what cultivates a sense of you being connected to your own essence and a sense of meaningfulness for yourself within this realm of life that is universal, like to all of us, sexuality. So whether or not you're having sex, it's our relationship to it, and how we can bring like a fuller sense of meaningfulness within this realm. At least that's how I see it. So any thoughts you have on that, Valerie?
Yeah, I would add to that, you know, that doing this exploration of essence, right? Because this again, you know, or at least how I see it is that, you know, the meaning making that I was referring to earlier, like what we're reaching for in sex is often, you know, we're reaching for something that's an imitation of our essence, right? So it's like wanting to feel this like freedom, or wanting to feel, you know, wholeness, right? And so we can have some of those experiences, you know, you can reach that or experience that anywhere, and sexuality is one of those parts. And so, yeah, I also wanted to add too that, this group is really is for everyone, right? It doesn't mean you don't have to have, like, you could have a very straightforward relationship to sexuality, and then here we're going to kind of just explore that more, right? You could have had trauma in your past with it. Like, that's welcome here too. We're not necessarily a trauma processing group, but don't let that keep you back if that's something that has been showing up in your sexuality, because we want to hold space for that as well. And you don't have to have like issues connected to sexuality. It's just all of these, just going on this journey together, talking about it, kind of seeing what comes up. Because I think that whenever we're focusing on and like kind of directly engaging with any aspect of our humanity, sexuality being one of them, like, we are going to learn stuff about ourselves. We are going to kind of directly engage with our current level of development, see where we've been, see where we want to go. And I think that sex is such a powerful topic for this. And it is hard to talk about. Sometimes it's really fun to talk about. But yeah, it's just such a dynamic topic.
Yes. And it strikes me that, we're touching on it very openly, right? In a public forum that's going to be disseminated, but like, we don't expect you to, I think we're like, so both of us have gotten all of these inquiries regarding it, but it's like that feeling of people just sitting on the fringe waiting to like, is it okay? Is this going to be safe? And so I wanted to speak to that, to say that the whole point of this group is that it's closed and it's small. And in order for us to journey together on these big topics, in a very precious and sacred way, and so recognizing that if you're intrigued by this kind of conversation, that you're going to have a space where you could talk about it. You could choose to join with your partner, or you could deliberately choose not to join with your partner if your partner did all, right? Just to really have a space where you can ask questions, right? We can explore the spiritual aspects, but you don't have to. That you can explore the therapeutic aspects, right? But you don't have to. And you can also listen in on other people making that exploration as well. And and how amazing that is to hear other people share, and oftentimes realize, oh my God, you're just like my partner, or just feeling, I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone in this. And so that's my hope. Thank you so much, Valerie, for joining me today. And I hope to have many future chats together. And I'm looking forward to this group together. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.